It has been said of the Gospel of John that it is a pool in which an elephant can swim and a child can wade. And the same can be said of Psalm 23. At first glance, it's a simple poem. It's easy for us to understand. It's easy for us to claim as our own and for ourselves. The water is clear enough to see the bottom. But the deeper we dive, the deeper it gets. If we dive in, we do not hit our heads on the bottom and hurt ourselves. But in fact, the deeper we dive, the farther away the bottom is. This simple poem is also an exceptionally complex poem, which is working on multiple levels at once, casting meaning in multiple directions at the same time. And so what I have to say about it this morning will be true to the best of my ability to discern. It will not be exhaustive. And I need to begin by acknowledging my debt to one of my heroes of the faith and one of my 2 or 3 greatest intellectual influences, the late Reverend Dr. Kenneth E. Bailey. And if you don't remember that name now, don't worry, you will be hearing it. Dr. Bailey was a Presbyterian missionary, and missionary's kid actually, teacher, pastor, and scholar who could say of himself for 60 years, from 1935 to 1995, my home was in the Middle East. He lived for decades among what he once called the last generation of Jesus' day. And he drew on that experience and on 2 millennia of Middle Eastern biblical translations and scholarship in teaching and interpreting the scriptures, particularly the New Testament, and especially the parables of Jesus. And he was not simply an amazing mind, an amazing teacher, he was an amazing human being. Humble, full of grace, dedicated to the church. He also had an amazing life story that I hope somebody sets down and writes out for us someday. But my understanding of the Word of God is much deeper and much, much richer because of his work and also because of his example. And I am profoundly thankful. And Dr. Bailey's last book, of which I also have yet to reach the bottom, was this one, The Good Shepherd. Not long before his death, he told a friend of mine who knew him fairly well, it only took me 40 years to write, as he saw it as the culmination and the completion of his life's work. And I'll quote this book a few times this morning, but my debt to him runs through every paragraph of this message, as does my gratitude. So with that said, let's open this psalm together. And let's start with the glaringly obvious. Psalm 23 centers on the image of God as shepherd. And this image is not unique to the psalm. It doesn't begin here. It was actually quite common in the ancient world for both human and divine rulers. And of course, a fairly wide range. If you've read Homer's Iliad, which I haven't, but all 4 of my kids have, that's its own story, you'll see it there. But it was especially common among the cultures of what we know as the Golden Crescent, the fertile area running from Egypt up through the mountains of Syria, down the valley of the Tigris and the Euphrates to the Persian Gulf. These cultures, Egypt, of course, and Syria, Assyria, Sumer, Babylon, etc., used the shepherd image extensively. So, for instance, King Tut was buried holding a shepherd's staff. Marduk, the head of the pantheon of Babylonian gods, was described as the one who shepherded the gods and the stars. And Hammurabi, the author of the Code of Hammurabi, if you've heard of that, one of the first legal codes we have in human history, described himself as having received the shepherd's crook from Marduk himself. And in the same way, Scripture uses shepherd imagery of God and of the rulers of Israel. And interestingly, not just the kings, but also the priests. Typically, when the priests are being referenced as shepherds, it's because they're bad shepherds. Ezekiel describes them as shepherds who eat the sheep under their care, and leave them to starve out in the wilderness. And most interestingly, Micah 5, which you might be familiar with, this is the one that says, "Out of you, Bethlehem, least among the clans of Judah, will come a ruler." Goes on to say of that ruler, of the Messiah, "He shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord." The relationship that this image portrays is one of absolute, utter dependence. Sheep are dumb fuzzies. They are as stubborn as they are stupid. They're also completely lacking in any means of defense or self-protection. They have nothing to fight anything, and they can't outrun anything either. Anything that might want to eat them, if it's simply animal versus sheep, is going to have a very nice dinner. If the shepherd is not good, and good in both senses, both capable and good in character, then the sheep are doomed, because they aren't finding their food and water in the safety of the village. They have to go out into the wild. As Dr. Bailey paints the picture, the moment they left the shelter and protection of the villages along the north-south ridge, sort of the mountain spine, west of the Jordan River, they were on their own. "The Lord is my shepherd" means, among other things, I have no police protection. In those open, trackless spaces, the traveler and his companions are alone. Thieves, wild animals, snakes, sudden blinding dust storms, water shortages, loose rocks, and furnace-like heat are all potential threats. To carry out that mission faithfully, the shepherd had to be willing, if necessary, to die for the sheep. Given that reality of utter dependence, to say the Lord is my shepherd means I am trusting totally in the Lord to provide what is needed, as the psalmist says in the second half of verse 1. And note, this is not a promise that he will give us everything we ask for, which is the lesson that my kindergarten self took away, from the old King James translation, "I shall not want." But it is not a promise that all our desires will be satisfied, but rather that all of our needs will be supplied. Of course, that takes some figuring, perhaps, and maybe some wrestling with ourselves. When it comes to imagining what our needs are, many of us are just like Han Solo. We can imagine quite a bit. So how do we know what's included in the statement, "I shall not be in need"? Well, that's actually what the rest of the poem gives us. It sort of works through that list. So first, the shepherd provides food. Specifically, it says, he leads sheep to green pastures, which is a striking statement because, as you know, if you've ever been anywhere around the Eastern Mediterranean, this is not a land notable for being green. The rainy season, is the winter, beginning sometime in November and running through sometime in February. During that period, it takes obviously a little while for the grass to turn green again. And once the rains stop, it quickly reverts back to yellow-brown and remains that way for the next 8 or 9 months. So the Lord is a shepherd who provides good food, not just the bare minimum. And the second need is water. And with sheep, this is complicated because sheep will not drink from rippling water. They're afraid to. So you can't just march them up to any old stream. For them to drink, the water must be either entirely still, or at least it must be flowing slowly enough that it looks entirely still. Basically, if they can't see their face in it and see whatever might be behind them, they will not drink, no matter how thirsty they are. They will wander up and down the stream and not stop until they find some little pool where the water is still. They will not drink until they find quiet waters. Yeah, I don't know if shepherds ever tried digging irrigation ditches. That might have been a thing to deal with the whole brown pasture thing. But I do know that they would dig short ditches off of fast-moving streams in order to create still water for their sheep to drink. So the shepherd gives the psalmist, gives the sheep good food and water. And third, he provides rest. And the traditional translation that we've been bequeathed by the King James, he makes me lie down. Grammatically, it's understandable. There's not a great way in English to put this, but it's misleading because you can't make a sheep lie down. You simply can't. They will not settle down until all their needs are met and they are completely unthreatened and unbothered. So, stomachs full, thirst slaked, no other animals around, no biting insects to disturb them. Then and only then will the sheep settle down to rest and to digest their food. So obviously, if they go too long without rest, it's not just a matter of lack of sleep. There's also the fact that the food just sort of stays there, does not get digested. And just to give you an idea exactly how skittish they are, Dr. Bailey notes that even the barking of one stray dog can cause an entire herd to jump up and even run off, if not stopped by an alert shepherd. Fourth, the shepherd provides guidance. On the way out from the village to the place of pasture, he does not walk behind them, prodding them and swatting them with a stick to keep them moving, as was the practice in some other cultures. But instead, he walks ahead of them, and he calls them to follow. And they would use a brief tune, maybe 10, 15 seconds long. He might play it on his shepherd's pipes, or he might sing it. Either way, he would repeat it regularly and often to keep the sheep focused on him. And the sheep know the shepherd's voice and are eager to follow. And so for that matter, in the morning, if there were different flocks in the village sheepfold, the shepherds would go individually and they would call the sheep, and their individual sheep would come trotting out, and follow them off to pasture. And those that weren't theirs would wait for their shepherd to show up. They know the shepherd's voice. Fifth, and this is a point which our English translations obscure, because the rendering we have in the King James is at least currently inadequate. He restores my soul. We've taken that and sort of psychologized it into something about having our spirits lifted and being made to feel better. And that's not wrong as far as it goes, but it doesn't go anywhere near far enough. The restoration that the psalmist envisions here is correction and rescue and deliverance. The verb in the first part of verse 3, the one that the King James translates restores, it's the verb shuv, which concretely means to turn around or to return. And so it was used in theological contexts, in context of behavior, to mean to repent. And so we can read this verb either of these two ways. He brings me back. He causes me to repent. I decided to kind of try to aim for the middle. That's why I rendered it, he brings me back when I stray. Because the image here is of a sheep which has strayed from the path, wandering away from the flock and the shepherd, and is now lost. And when the shepherd discovers that one of his sheep is missing, he goes looking for it immediately. You can think of the parable Jesus tells in Luke 15. If the shepherd is out in the wilderness, has 100 sheep, one of them's missing, he leaves the 99 and he goes looking. Why? Because when a sheep, like I said earlier, they're dumb fuzzies. They truly look no further than the next blade of grass. And so they can very easily follow that next blade of grass to a point where they are thoroughly lost and isolated before they notice that anything is wrong. And the problem is that when a sheep looks up and realizes it's alone and it doesn't know where it is, it will not try to retrace its steps. Sheep do not problem solve. What it will do instead is find the first thing it can hide under, even a little bit, be it a bush, a rock, whatever, and then it will collapse. Its legs will give out, and it will start bleating at the top of its lungs, which this is like a homing beacon or a GPS tracker for every predator anywhere in the area. So the shepherd is racing against time. And when he finds that sheep, that's when the hard part begins. Because it is far too traumatized with fear to walk. So when he finds it, he'll have to pick it up and carry it, most likely around his neck with the legs dangling down in front, holding onto those. And then he has to make it back to the flock, carrying the sheep. Which means that if there are any predators around, he will have to deal with them with a sheep around his neck. That might be worse than an albatross around the neck, I'm not sure. And once he's brought the sheep back to the flock, he will lead it in the right path, the path in which it is supposed to walk. Now, note this. What's the right path for a sheep? The answer is simple. It is the path which leads as safely as possible to the next green pasture and still water. The shepherd has not chosen the path because he doesn't want the sheep to enjoy life. He has not chosen the path because he's a killjoy who wants to make sure they don't have any fun. He has not chosen the path because he's on a power trip and it inflates his ego to have other beings do what they're told. He has chosen this path because he knows the other paths that the sheep might follow do not lead to life and would not end well for them. This one might lead to the edge of a steep cliff. That one might lead into a dead-end canyon. This is the path which leads to life for the sheep. And note this well. The shepherd doesn't do this for money. He doesn't do this because someone's making him. He does it, and Jesus stresses this as well, he does it for his own sake. For the sake of his integrity and his honor and his reputation as a good shepherd who cares well for the sheep. Now, there's, of course, a flip side to this. If there are paths which look like life, but lead only to death, it's also true that the path of the shepherd, though it is ultimately the way to life, sometimes looks like a death road. And the psalmist acknowledges that reality. There will be times when the shepherd will lead the flock through the valley of the shadow of death. That cannot be avoided. And be it noted here, this is not just a metaphor. It's not just an image. These are real places. And in fact, we have one in the United States, at least one that I know of. It's called the Black Canyon of the Gunnison on the western slope of Colorado. And I've been there. It is impressive. The Black Canyon is 48 miles long. The central 14 of it are contained actually within a national park, but it's a lot longer than that, 48 miles. At its deepest point, 2,722 feet. And the canyon floor narrows to just 40 feet wide. One side of the canyon is a cliff. The other side thinks it's a cliff. Because it turns out I didn't know this before we went there, canyon walls don't erode much if they don't get any sun. And these walls mostly don't. There are parts of the canyon floor which only get 30 minutes of sunshine a day. And I believe that's at the height of summer. I'm sure you can guess that's where the canyon got its name. Now, those that David and his fellow shepherds would have known were much shorter, much less deep. You would have, for instance, a description given to us by an Armenian Methodist pastor, M.P. Krikorian, who in his high school years herded sheep in Palestine. This was roughly the 1920s, I believe. But he describes one that is just south of the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, one which it sounds like was well known to every shepherd in the region. By his account, that one was 5 miles long, and at the widest point, 12 feet across. At the narrowest points, there was barely enough room even for a sheep to turn around. And in that part of the Holy Land, these valleys were actually fairly common. Because remember, you had this seasonal alteration between dry weather and baking sun and heavy rains, even torrential rains. You know, it's so that you had extreme water flow to wash gullies and to carve them deeper and deeper and deeper. You had the temperature changes to bake and crack the ground, thus opening more for the water. So there's a fair number, of these in the region. And they were most dangerous during the rainy season, when flash floods could hit without warning. If you have ever heard of the city of Petra, the ancient city of Petra? It was the capital of the Nabatean Empire. It wasn't one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, but that's just because the folks who made that list didn't know about it. But it's a city that's literally carved into building faces and everything, carved into the rock. And the entrance to it is one of these valleys, about 30 feet deep, quite narrow, somewhere between half a mile and a mile long. And there have been instances when tourist groups were visiting Petra, flash floods would come thundering through the city and through the canyon that was the way out. And people have been just swept away, washed away. And that's in the modern world with our ability to predict the weather. You can imagine what it would have been for them. But even during the dry season, these steep, dark valleys were still places of increased danger from robbers, from predators, and also from loose rocks. Doesn't necessarily take much to dislodge one of those. Danger lurked in the dark, and they could be terrifying. And it's in response to that the psalmist declares, even in the valley of the shadow of death, I will not be afraid. The shepherd, along with everything else, gives peace in the place of fear. And it is in 2 ways that are noted here. One is the peace of the shepherd's presence. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And this connects back to what we said about the shepherd providing guidance. To us, the valley of the shadow is dark and unknowable. We cannot see a way through. But the shepherd knows that there is a way through, and he knows the way. We can trust that the shepherd who is with us is not just leading us into the valley of the shadow of death, full stop. He's leading us through it. And the other is the peace of the shepherd's protection. Your rod and your staff comfort me. And the rod was the shepherd's main weapon. Think in your minds, begin with a baseball bat. Now, make the handle thicker, because it's not primarily about making it as light as possible. It's about making sure it won't break. Then, make it a heavier, denser wood. Maybe widen the end a little bit, shape maybe a bit more like a mace. And then take pieces of iron, spikes, nails, things of that sort, and embed those in the end. This is the rod of iron that we talked about last week from Psalm 2. It's the weapon that David told Saul that he used to kill the lion and the bear when they were threatening the flock that he was shepherding. The staff, meanwhile, was a walking stick around 5 feet long, very useful to have, in rough terrain, hilly territory, long walks. And you've probably seen pictures of this, had a crook on the end. And the crook is the main reason that it comforts the sheep. Because, as Dr. Bailey puts it, when a lamb cannot scramble down from a ledge, or falls into a crevice, or down a bank into a stream, they're not just stupid, they're clumsy. The shepherd is able, with a crook in his staff, to catch the lamb by a leg or a shoulder and gently lift it back onto the path. The rod is protection from others. The staff is protection from ourselves. In verse 5, the image shifts from God as shepherd to God as host. And the scene that's envisioned here is a typical meal, which is not kind of how our things work, silverware and plates and all that sort of thing. Rather, they would have a low, flat, round table. And all the folks eating would be sitting cross-legged on the floor around it. The food prepared would be in a bowl in the center. And everybody had a flatbread, which was an edible utensil, basically. Tear a piece off, dip it in the bowl, pop it in your mouth. Repeat process, until you have had enough to eat. Sort of like chips and salsa, except that was the entire way they did everything. And normally, the host would provide the food. That was his responsibility. And either the servants or the women would prepare the food. That was women's work. But here the psalmist says, God prepares the meal. So that's just an interesting thing to note. We've had previously a very, very masculine image, the shepherd out beating up lions with a stick. And it shifts, and we now have would have been a traditionally feminine image for them, for God. And God welcomes the psalmist as an honored guest. He anoints his head with scented oil. He makes sure his cup is constantly refilled. He takes a sip. Someone is there, one of the servants, maybe the host himself, filling it back up. It overflows because the main point is to make sure it stays full. And he does this with complete disregard for who's watching. Knowing that among those watching are his guests' enemies. He knows how they will respond. And he chooses to disregard it. Think of Jesus and Zacchaeus in Luke 19. Jesus mortally offending the entire village by going into that man's house to eat with him. The house of the pariah. The house of the crook who was robbing them blind. The house of the despised collaborator with the hated Romans. Jesus went into that house. That sort of behavior was one of the things that fueled Jesus' enemies. They loathed and despised his costly love for sinners. And he did not care. He did not care. And this brings us to the last verse. Let's take this in chunks. First, we have two things together: goodness and chesed. Goodness is as straightforward as it sounds. The Hebrew is tov. It's basically what you expect it to be. The Hebrew word chesed is another one that you'll hear from me quite a bit because it is loaded. I translated it here, unrelenting love. It's the concept that's at the heart of covenant. The relentless, unyielding, unfailing, undaunted, indomitable, and completely without need to rest or to pause, commitment to love and faithfulness to one's covenant partner. It's what Sally Lloyd-Jones in her beautiful Jesus Storybook Bible calls God's never stopping, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever love, which always keeps its promises and refuses to love us any less no matter what we do. It's my favorite Hebrew word. There are a number of them, but this is my very favorite. So we have this pairing. We have goodness, and we have, mercy definitely an aspect of it, but we have this pursuing faithfulness and love of God, which, the psalmist says, will follow me. And there are two aspects of this. We've seen them both in the psalm. One, this is the love which pursues us and always will pursue us, bearing goodness in its arms, following the lost sheep to bring it back. Two, this is protection. Outward bound, the sheep do not have any idea where they are going. The shepherd leads. He calls them on step by step. Going back home, they know the way, at least from a certain point. And so the shepherd no longer needs to walk in front, so instead, he walks behind, where he can see anything that might be coming from anywhere across the front arc, and he is standing between them and any predators which might be following for a completely different reason. The shepherd follows as the rear guard. So third, I will dwell in the house of the Lord. Does that mean the church? Yes, but not only. Certainly in this world, this is a reality which is anchored in our corporate worship. Remember, a sheep on its own is lost. And remember that all the blessings that are laid out in the psalm, even really the blessing of rescue, apply to sheep as part of a flock. You would not lead a sheep out by itself. Economically speaking, it would never be feasible. But in addition, this does mean learning to live in the whole world as God's house. He made every inch. He loves all of it. He is alive and at work in every particle of his creation. And we are called to live in it as his sacred space, not as just the raw material for our own desires. And just a quick note. This is not fuel for the sorts of folks who say, oh, well, I can go play golf, and have a nice spiritual experience. I don't need to be in church. It'd be rather more like being out and asking, did God really want this turned into a golf course? And if he didn't, should I be out here? And what does that mean? And be clear, I'm not saying that God has anything against golf courses. At least not out here. Lots of water, lots of green grass, lots of good terrain. But I will say, though, as a child of the Mountain West, as a former pastor at the headwaters of the Colorado, the sorts of folks who do things like build golf courses in the middle of the Mojave Desert and are contributing to the fact that by the time it reaches Mexico, there is no Colorado River anymore, they might have a little bit more reason to reevaluate their life choices at that point. Because it really is about, the world being holy to the Lord and living in it in that way. But all of these things that are laid out, David says they will be true for as long as there are days. Does that mean our days? Does that mean God's days? Yes. Because it's a promise both ways. One, and we need this, the goodness and the chesed, the loving kindness, the unrelenting love, the faithful covenant promises of God are new every morning. They will never run out. They will never fail to reach us. They will never not be enough for today. And that will be true for as long as there are days in our lives. For as long as we are in this world, that is true for us. And when all things are made new, when all things are made right, well, that'll still be true. And then it'll be true for all of God's days, eternally. We, like the sheep, are not at home. We are out in the wild and dangerous world. But we are homeward bound, and we need not fear. God's goodness and his chesed pursue us when we stray. They are our rear guard against the attacks of the enemy. Our shepherd is with us. And no matter what we may face, he will bring us safely all the way home. Let's pray.